July 4th, 1996. On this summer day, justice in Britain took a turn that many would later describe as one of its darkest failures. John Haas and his nephew Paul Bennett, two notorious drug smugglers and career criminals, walked free from prison less than a year into their 18-year sentences. Their release was not the result of new evidence or a courtroom victory. It was a royal pardon, granted on the grounds that the men had provided vital information to authorities. To the public, it looked as though justice had been served swiftly and decisively. Yet beneath the surface lay a troubling contradiction. These were not reformed men, nor repentant criminals. They were cunning manipulators who had fooled the system itself. How did two gangsters, deeply tied to Liverpool's criminal underworld, manage to outwit judges, police, and even the Home Secretary? And more importantly, what does this scandal reveal about the vulnerabilities of Britain's justice system? John Haas was born in Liverpool in 1948, a city already marked by economic decline and the growth of organized crime. From an early age, he became entangled in petty thefts and robberies, setting the tone for a life defined by lawlessness. His criminal record grew steadily, with convictions for serious crimes including bank robbery, which established him as a figure well known to both the police and the courts. Haas was not a small-time offender. He was a career criminal who thrived in the dangerous world of Liverpool's underworld. Alongside him stood his nephew, Paul Bennett. Together they formed a partnership that would make them feared names across Merseyside. They were not simply opportunistic criminals chasing quick gains. They were men who treated crime as a profession, building contacts, establishing networks, and using intimidation to cement their reputation. Their operations stretched beyond local schemes, reaching into large-scale smuggling and drug distribution. Their most significant connection was with Curtis Warren, one of Britain's most notorious drug traffickers, often described as Britain's Pablo Escobar. Warren's empire linked Europe to South America through vast narcotics pipelines, and Haas's association with him elevated his own status. This tie placed Haas and Bennett not only within Liverpool's gangland, but at the edge of international crime. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Liverpool had become a critical hub for heroin and cocaine entering the United Kingdom. The docks, once the heart of the city's prosperity, became the entry points for smuggled goods, and criminal syndicates thrived in the vacuum left by collapsing industries. Haas and Bennett exploited these conditions to full effect. Their knowledge of the city, combined with their ruthlessness, allowed them to operate with remarkable influence. Haas was feared but also respected in the underworld. To rivals, he was a threat. To associates, a man capable of making deals that could bring fortunes. But to law enforcement, he was a symbol of how deeply organized crime had taken root in Liverpool. By the time of their arrest in 1993, Haas and Bennett had built reputations not just as criminals, but as architects of schemes that challenged the very system meant to stop them. In 1993, British authorities were closing in on one of the largest heroin operations in the country's history. At the heart of the investigation was a shipment worth around $18 million, part of a vast supply line run by a Turkish trafficker known as Volkan. The drugs were destined for Liverpool, a city that had become a key gateway for the illegal trade. For customs and excise, this was not just another drug bust. It was an opportunity to dismantle a network that stretched far beyond local dealers. Officers worked methodically, tracking movements, intercepting communications, and following the trail of the massive consignment. The operation demanded patience and precision. Arrests began to sweep across Liverpool as members of the trafficking ring were rounded up. It was a moment of triumph for law enforcement, who believed they were finally breaking the backbone of a dangerous criminal pipeline. But amid the successes, two names continued to evade capture: John Haas and Paul Bennett. The pair moved carefully, slipping through the cracks as their associates were taken down. For investigators, the chase grew increasingly tense. Haas and Bennett were not simply two more criminals in the chain. They were the masterminds who kept the operation alive. Letting them escape would mean leaving the core of the problem untouched. After weeks of relentless pursuit, the breakthrough came. Haas and Bennett had managed to distance themselves from Liverpool and were hiding in Croydon, South London. It was a calculated move, a bid to stay one step ahead, while the authorities tightened their grip on the smuggling network back home. But the net was already closing. Officers moved in and finally arrested the pair, bringing an end to their short-lived run from justice. Their capture was hailed as a major victory. With the heroin shipment seized, the gang dismantled, and its leaders in custody, the case seemed like a decisive blow against organized crime. Yet even in this moment of apparent triumph, questions lingered. Haas and Bennett were seasoned criminals with long histories of deception. Could their arrest truly mean the end of their schemes? Or was it only the beginning of something even more audacious? When John Haas and Paul Bennett finally stood before the court, the scale of their crimes was laid bare. The 1993 heroin seizure had shocked Britain, not only for its size, an estimated $18 million worth of drugs, but for what it revealed about Liverpool's role in the global narcotics trade. Judge David Lynch listened as the prosecution detailed how the two men had built their empire, smuggling on an industrial scale while leaving addiction and violence in their wake. The verdict was clear. Both Haas and Bennett were sentenced to 18 years in prison, a punishment meant to send a strong message about the cost of organized crime. But the story did not end with the sentencing. Behind the courtroom doors, a quiet negotiation was already taking shape. Their solicitor, Tony Nelson, suggested that if his clients could provide information of genuine value to the authorities, that cooperation might be rewarded. Paul Cook, the senior customs officer leading the investigation, entertained the possibility. Haas and Bennett hinted they had knowledge of hidden weapons stashes across the country, stockpiles that could fall into the hands of dangerous criminals if left undiscovered. It was a bold move, and one that raised a difficult question for law enforcement. Should two convicted drug traffickers be trusted to play the role of informants? The stakes were enormous. If their claims were true, the information could prevent further bloodshed. If false, it risked undermining the credibility of the justice system itself. Judge Lynch himself became involved, writing privately to the Home Secretary to stress the potential importance of the intelligence being offered. What began as a straightforward conviction now carried the scent of an extraordinary bargain, one that hinted at the possibility of leniency in exchange for cooperation. For Haas and Bennett, the prison walls may have closed around them, but their path forward was far from ordinary. They were already setting in motion a plan that would test the boundaries of trust, mercy, and the very integrity of British justice. On July 4, 1996, the British public was stunned. John Haas and Paul Bennett, two of the country's most notorious drug traffickers, walked free from prison after serving barely a year of their 18-year sentences. The decision was not the result of an appeal, nor some quiet clerical error. It came from the highest level of government, under what is known as the royal prerogative of mercy. The roots of this extraordinary release lay in a letter written by Judge David Lynch, the very man who had once sentenced them. In his letter to the Home Secretary, he stressed that Haas and Bennett had provided vital intelligence that had allowed authorities to seize dangerous weapons, machine guns, pistols, and even explosives such as Semtex. These were not small-scale discoveries. The cache included AK-47 assault rifles and Israeli-made Uzis, weapons capable of unleashing bloodshed on Britain's streets. Judge Lynch argued that the men's cooperation had undoubtedly saved lives, and that such service to the public interest warranted consideration for early release. Michael Howard, the Home Secretary at the time, acted on that recommendation. He approved their release through the royal pardon system, a mechanism so rarely used that many in Britain had barely heard of it. For a government that had pledged to take a hard line on crime, the decision was both shocking and politically dangerous. Almost overnight, two men once branded as major drug lords were presented as informants who had supposedly helped protect the country from violence. But cracks in the story soon began to appear. Questions arose almost immediately. Were the weapons truly discovered as a direct result of Haas and Bennett's tips, or had they found a way to manipulate the system? Investigators who looked back at the operation noted inconsistencies. Some stashes seemed oddly convenient, located in areas already under suspicion by police. Others were so poorly concealed that it strained belief to think of them as genuine underworld stockpiles. Critics began to suggest a darker possibility, that Haas and Bennett had orchestrated the entire scheme themselves. Could it be that they arranged for weapons to be planted, only to later reveal their locations in exchange for leniency? If true, the scandal would not only expose a calculated deception, but also reveal a staggering weakness in the justice system. The very institutions meant to protect the public may have been played like pawns in a dangerous game. For Michael Howard, the backlash was immediate. Newspapers ran headlines questioning how the Home Secretary could justify freeing men with such blood-stained reputations. Opposition MPs accused the government of hypocrisy, asking how it could claim to be tough on crime while quietly cutting deals with major traffickers. The controversy deepened when it became clear just how rarely the royal prerogative of mercy had been used. Haas and Bennett were among a tiny handful of criminals in modern British history to benefit from such a decision. What was meant to be a triumph of intelligence-led policing quickly turned into a political storm. The release of Haas and Bennett was not remembered as a victory against organized crime, but as one of the most brazen examples of the justice system being manipulated. And at the heart of it all remained a haunting question. Had Britain's leaders freed two dangerous criminals because they had been genuinely helpful, or because they had been outwitted? For years, John Haas had built his reputation on fear, loyalty, and calculated risk. But what came to light while he was behind bars revealed something far darker. From the confines of prison, Haas signed an affidavit that shook the very foundation of his previous claims. In his own words, he admitted that the weapons supposedly uncovered thanks to his cooperation with the authorities had never been the result of genuine intelligence. They had been planted. His associates on the outside had staged the entire thing, hiding caches of guns only so that Haas and Paul Bennett could later discover them through tip-offs. It was an audacious scheme, designed not only to reduce their sentences, but to manipulate the justice system itself. Every raid that followed their guidance had been orchestrated theater. Police officers believed they were removing dangerous weapons from the streets. In truth, they were pawns in an elaborate con. The irony was brutal. What had been hailed as groundbreaking intelligence work was nothing more than a criminal masterclass in deceit. The affidavit stripped away the last pretense of legitimacy. It revealed that the pair had turned cooperation into a business model. They would promise intelligence, have their allies stage discoveries, and then enjoy the rewards of leniency. For the justice system, the revelation was devastating. It meant that Haas and Bennett's early release was not a victory for law and order, but a calculated betrayal. When news of the scam reached the public, outrage spread quickly. How could men convicted of trafficking $18 million worth of heroin walk free on the basis of lies? The scandal spilled into the halls of Parliament, where debates grew heated. MPs from Liverpool in particular demanded answers, pointing to the devastating toll heroin had already taken on the city. Families torn apart, children lost to addiction, entire neighborhoods ravaged. These were the real costs, and they had been compounded by a system that allowed criminals to game the very laws meant to stop them. Some MPs accused the Home Office of being naive, even reckless, in granting the royal pardon. Others suggested something worse, that the authorities had been so eager to claim victories against organized crime that they had turned a blind eye to the risks. Was it desperation? Was it incompetence? Or was it simply the irresistible temptation of a shortcut that promised quick results in the fight against drugs and guns? The scandal became a symbol of broken trust. For the people of Liverpool, the message was clear. The state had not only failed to protect them, but had actively enabled two of the city's most notorious criminals to walk free. The same streets that had been flooded with heroin were now flooded with anger. Haas's affidavit was more than a confession. It was a reminder of how far corruption and manipulation can reach when ambition collides with desperation. What began as an effort to protect communities had instead betrayed them, leaving scars that would not be easily forgotten. By 2008, the long and winding saga of John Haas and Paul Bennett reached its decisive end. After years of maneuvering, exploiting loopholes, and manipulating the justice system, both men were finally brought back before the courts. This time, they were not standing trial for drugs, but for something even more damning: perverting the course of justice. The evidence laid out against them was staggering. Investigators revealed how Haas and Bennett had engineered one of the most audacious frauds in British criminal history. Their supposed cooperation with authorities in the 1990s, when they offered up information about hidden weapons caches, was exposed as a calculated lie. The stashes had been planted deliberately to buy themselves freedom. What had once been hailed as valuable intelligence was now seen for what it truly was: an elaborate deception. When the sentences were handed down, the gravity of their crimes was reflected in the punishment. Haas received 22 years, and Bennett was given 20. These were not just prison terms, they were a message. The courts were declaring that manipulation of justice itself is as serious a crime as the drug empires they once ran. For Haas and Bennett, there would be no deals, no early releases, and no more clever schemes. Their game was over. The revelations sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom. How could two seasoned criminals have managed to deceive not only the police and customs officers, but also the Home Secretary himself? The scandal raised troubling questions about the very foundations of the justice system. If such manipulation was possible, how many other cases might have slipped through the cracks? Public outrage was fierce. Newspapers called it one of the most shameful episodes in modern British legal history. Commentators demanded answers, and voices grew louder for a full inquiry into how the system had been fooled so completely. For many, the case symbolized the dangerous mix of desperation and naivety that allowed criminals to outwit the very institutions meant to contain them. In the end, the convictions of 2008 closed the chapter on Haas and Bennett, but the shadow of their deception lingered, leaving Britain to wrestle with a painful truth. Even the strongest systems can be vulnerable when ambition meets corruption. The trial of John Haas and Paul Bennett may have ended with convictions, but the ripple effects of their case continued long after the courtroom doors closed. What they had managed to pull off was not just a massive smuggling operation, but an audacious manipulation of the very system designed to stop men like them. Their case left behind an uncomfortable question: how could Britain's justice system be turned so easily into a tool for criminals? In the years that followed, debates raged across legal and political circles. Some argued that granting leniency to informants was a necessary strategy in the fight against organized crime. Others insisted the Haas and Bennett scandal had revealed a dangerous loophole, one that allowed career criminals to play the role of saviors while still profiting from destruction. The controversy was more than just a footnote in legal history. It became a warning about the fine line between cooperation and corruption. For John Haas, notoriety became part of his legacy. He was remembered not only as a smuggler of staggering scale, but as one of the boldest manipulators in modern British criminal history. He had stood in the dock as a convicted drug trafficker, yet within months convinced the highest authorities to grant him a royal pardon. Few criminals had ever reached such heights of audacity, and fewer still had done it under the public eye of an entire nation. The legacy of Paul Bennett was no less tangled. Though often overshadowed by Haas's brash personality, he too had played his part in orchestrating a deception that would stain the credibility of law enforcement and the courts. Their names became shorthand for a scandal that continues to haunt discussions of justice reform. The story of Haas and Bennett is more than a tale of crime. It is a reflection of vulnerability, exposing cracks in a system that prides itself on being unshakable. It asks us to look closer at the balance of power between criminals and the state, between truth and expediency. And it leaves us with a chilling reminder. If the system could be fooled once, how safe are we from it happening again?